Traditionally, Australia's federal budget is handed down once a year in May. But in 2022, the change of government in May creates the need for an additional budget to align the government's finances with the priorities that Labor took to the election. Joining me to discuss these change of priorities, as well as the outlook for the Australian economy, is our Chief Economist, Bill Evans. Bill, welcome.
Thanks very much, Elliot.
It's good to be back with you again.
Yes. It seems only yesterday that we met before.
Almost. So, Bill, it has only been kind of 7 or so months since that last budget. But obviously we've had a lot of different forces affecting the global economy since then. So volatile markets, aggressive inflation, quite significant rate hikes. How has that all impacted the starting position for this budget?
Well, Australia was a big beneficiary of all that volatility. So back in March, that March budget assumed that the deficit for 22-23 was going to be 3.6% of GDP. And in today's budget, that number came in at 1.4% of GDP. That's a $50 billion improvement. About $30 billion of that was on the revenue side, and about $20 billion of that was on the expenditure side. On the revenue side, about 2/3 of it was due to company tax with strong commodity prices, and about 1/3 of it due to very strong employment growth. And on the other side, it was due to some programs that hadn't been spent, and also smaller social benefits. So it's been quite a big change. But the interesting thing about the budget's numbers are that whereas back in March, the deficit was expected to fall from 3.6% of GDP down to 1.6% of GDP over the 4 years. This time, the starting point is 1.4% of GDP, but the deficit is expected to rise to 1.8% of GDP, and therein lies some challenges for the government.
So just thinking about sort of the new measures that are in this budget, what do you think are the most significant?
Look, if I look at the initiatives as a proportion of GDP, 0.1%. Now let's get that into perspective. In the March budget, it was 1.7% of GDP. In the two COVID budgets, it was nearly 5% of GDP. Even in the 2019 budget, it was 0.5% of GDP. So this was an incredibly disciplined budget on the expenditure side. There were two key items. The first one was childcare, and making that cheaper. That was $4.7 billion. And then there was a very welcome addition of about $3.5 billion for aged care. But apart from that, the initiatives were quite small, but we saw two very important investment initiatives, $2.2 billion for the NBIN and $1.2 billion for more connectivity for rural areas. So they were the two big investment initiatives, and also about $600 million at this stage for the incredibly ambitious affordable housing initiative. Government's talking in the budget papers of 1 million new houses. In terms of the first stage of the initiative, only 20,000. I think the key is to try and attract interest from the private sector to really drive this process. And of course, with the private sector now becoming more inclined to support the residential housing market, we may well see some real good results there.
So Westpac has a view that we will see the cash rate rise to 3.6% in March of next year. Are there any implications sort of from this budget for that view?
Well, I think the risk would have been if the budget had been putting upward pressure on spending. But as I said, spending initiatives only 0.1% of GDP. So there's certainly no additional pressure on these inflation pressures coming from the budget. But of course, if you look at the budget forecast for 22-23, they're looking at inflation at 5.5%. So we're going to see very strong inflation, and that of course is the key factor behind the Reserve Bank needing to get moving and continue to raise rates.
So Bill, how do you assess the overall challenge of the government's fiscal position as set out in the budget papers?
Well, I think that is by far the most interesting aspect of the budget papers. So if we think about what is a reasonable objective for fiscal policy, in my opinion, it's to stabilise gross debt to GDP ratio at an internationally competitive level. So in the March budget, that was targeted. The projection was that they'd be stabilising that debt at around 40% of GDP, which I thought was quite reasonable. In this budget, it doesn't look to me as if there's clear stability. In the 2033, 2034 numbers, it looks like they're up as high as 47% of GDP. And the problem is that two components have been lifted incredibly in the budget numbers. The first one is interest, $30 billion more in interest by 2033-34. And the second one is the NDIS, around $28 billion more in spending on the NDIS by that time. So those two initiatives, along with the other spending initiatives that are worth about $22 billion, that's the additional challenge that this budget has highlighted relative to the March budget, where the starting point was much higher, but the projections were a lot more comforting than the ones we're seeing in this budget. And it screams out to me that we're going to have to see substantial budget repair announced in the May budget next year. It'll be the timing for the budget repair. It'll be 2 years before the election. We have these incredibly short 3-year election cycles. So it's really that budget 2 years before the election that provides the appropriate timing. And that challenge to get a much better stability in that long-term debt to GDP ratio is going to require some incredibly ambitious policies, given the blowout that we've seen in the interest in the NDIS and in the other expenditures.
So, in your view, are there particular areas of policy or particular initiatives that you would like to see discussed between now and the next budget?
Well, the one that worries me the most is the stage 3 tax cuts, which I think is absolutely necessary for our economy to provide incentive for higher income earners to lift the threshold at which the top marginal tax rate comes in to 200,000. If it was indexed from the last time it changed, it would now be 250,000. To rebalance, only marginally, but to at least rebalance the share of direct income tax relative to indirect income tax. But it's 20 billion a year. That's rising, of course, and that's a big number. So you think about that, that's almost 1% of GDP. So if you are challenged by the fact that the deficit is growing and that ratio is continuing to increase, the projection is that by the end of the end of the projections, it'll be up at 1.8% of GDP. If you take 1% off, that's a huge progress. So, but that's where I think you're going to see substantial debate over the next 6 months, because it would clearly be a very easy way to improve the fiscal position, but I think it'll be bad economics. Now, hopefully, there'll be other aspects of spending that will come into play, because spending as a proportion of GDP has averaged 24.9%, and the number by the end of the projected periods here is 27.1%. So there's a real need, I think, to address the spending. But of course, as we said, a lot of that is being driven by this NDIS, by this interest payments, and so the government's got some big issues to deal with between now and the next budget. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation when we have our next discussion in May next year.
I think we will. I look forward to it in just 6 months' time. Well, thank you, Bill, for your insights. We really appreciate them as always. And just thank you for taking the time to spend with us and discussing the budget. I'd like to just encourage all our viewers to head along to our research portal, Westpac IQ, where you'll see a full rundown of our analysis of the budget 2022, as well as our views on the Australian economy and the globe as well. I'll see you next time.